This is the story of whiskey, and I started right here in the heart of Tokyo. Around these streets are bars crammed with people imbibing the amber liquid. It'll be a fascinating journey, so come with me as I tell the story of Scotland's gift to the world. I'm going on a pilgrimage to find out why such a simple drink has come to mean so much.
Hi, my name's Jim, I'm from Scotland.
From the makers to the marketeers, and the chemists to the cocktail makers, and from the Highlands to Hobart in Tasmania. I'll be meeting the people and travelling to the places immersed in Scottish whisky's world story. This is the tale of an ancient craft that became a global colossus. It is the tale of Scotch. Today, we treat Scotch whisky with reverence. Yet as recently as the late 1970s, it was viewed altogether differently. When people thought of Scotch, they thought of old-fashioned, untrendy blended whiskies. It was something of a safe, boring choice. Here, what your granda drank at Hogmanay, and abroad, ignored in favour of domestic spirits. By the early 1980s, too much was being made for not enough drinkers, creating a whisky loch of untouched liquid. Many distilleries closed. Then the industry recovered on the back of an unlikely source, single malts. Marketing was once more at the forefront via a bottle label vision of Scotland sold to the world. Now malts are booming, desirable and collectible, and provoke global interest in Scotland. On Edinburgh's Royal Mile stands a building symbolic of this intrigue. The Scotch whisky experience is funded by a cluster of drinks companies. Among its greatest attractions is a breathtaking hoard of bottles. This marble and glass shrine to whisky contains 3,348 bottles. It is a magnificent collection and was collected by one man, Clive Vidas, a Brazilian from Sao Paulo. It took him 35 years to collect. And then he came to a financial arrangement with Diageo, and Diageo brought the collection here to Scotland. And as Mr. Vidas himself says, we have an expression in Brazil, the good son returns home, and in my view the collection is back with its family now. And here is Mr. Vidas.
This is where it all began. He was well known as being a real lover of Scotch whisky, and business associates would always pick up a bottle in duty free for him. But finally a business associate went to visit him from Scotland and said, this is the real stuff. This is the stuff you'll never have heard of. It's called single malt Scotch whisky. And this is the stuff to keep and enjoy with only your very best friends.
What date was this?
So this was in the 1970s.
Right.
And really only blended Scotch whisky was exported at the time. It was very, very hard to find anything else. So these 6 bottles here were given to Clive then, and rather than sharing them with his very best friends, he was so overwhelmed and so passionate about them that he never opened them, and this began the Scotch whisky collection.
Now, people come from all over the world to view this, don't they?
That's right. About 80% of the visitors that come here are from overseas. So it just reflects the huge pool that Scotch whisky has and the kudos that it has from an international point of view.
So they come because they love whisky in the first place?
Well,
they don't just pop in on a rainy day and think, where are we going to go in there?
Well, you know, they don't come because they already know and love Scotch whisky. Most of our visitors are from overseas, have heard of Scotch whisky, know what it is, but aren't already Scotch whisky drinkers. So a small proportion of them love it and are enthusiasts and know about this collection and have made a bit of a pilgrimage. But the majority of them have come to Scotland, and there is no way that they could visit Scotland without finding out more about Scotch whisky, because the two are so intrinsically linked.
You've got a black Bowmore from 1964. What on earth is that worth?
You've focused in on one of those bottles that's completely unique, really rare, only sold at auction. But equally, we have the opposite end of the spectrum. We even have whiskey and cola in a can. So there's nothing too precious about this. It's a snapshot of every single bottle of whiskey that was different, that was individual, that was unique, and that was collected over that period.
So if you had to put a figure on the Blackburn Moor, what would it be?
Ooh, tens of thousands.
Seriously?
Now. Yeah. One of those ones that goes very well at auction.
Over the last few years, there's been a quiet revolution happening in the whisky industry in Scotland. And that is the fact that we currently have about 20 small craft distilleries, with another 10 waiting to be operational. And they make whisky in the old style, when whisky was made in a small room or a little button bay in a croft or a barn somewhere in a Highland glen. And it's a bit like the craft beer revolution that's really exploded over the United Kingdom in the last few years, and it's really going to make a radical difference to whisky and our choices. And I'm standing in front of what is probably the smallest craft distillery in Scotland.
Welcome, David, to the smallest distillery in Scotland.
This is a dinky little thing, Tony.
It's a miniature whiskey distillery. It's also a bit like an adult's Meccano kit.
This is a prime example of a small craft distillery, isn't it?
There's currently 16 producing. We were the first. And we had a meeting here because so many people were asking me questions. And I said, oh, well, let's get together. And we had 50 people turn up. And it's not just whiskey. There's whiskey, there's gin, there's vodka, there's a rum distillery in the heart of Speyside.
I love it.
Just because a distillery is small doesn't necessarily make it well crafted. But some of the small distillers are producing products of astonishing interest, astonishing versatility. Not all will survive. There will be a shakeout of that sector. But craft is certainly adding a lot of interest, it's adding a lot of vivacity, and it's adding a lot of choice for the consumer. So, on balance, it can only be good.
Tony, are you a threat to the big boys?
Not at all.
I mean, you're creating very, very special whiskies.
Probably the best way to sum this distillery up. If you drive up the A9 and you overtake a single whiskey tanker, that's our year's production in one tanker. What we do supply to the big industry is a comparable quality product, and quality is the link between both of us. So the big distilleries produce millions of litres a year, but you couldn't lean against the stills like this and have a conversation.
No, you couldn't.
You couldn't turn the steam up slightly while we're doing it. People can come here and spend a week making their own whiskey. They can come in on the Monday morning and put the grist into the grist hopper, and on the Friday, after 2 distillations, they can make their own whiskey.
There is clear excitement about the craft movement, and it bristles with possibility. Whether in the long term each new distillery is financially viable, though, remains open to debate. Craft distilleries are just one threat among many to the traditional and dominant Scotch whisky industry. Whisky is now made in almost 30 countries. Old Scottish methods are making for a vibrant scene, biting at the heels of Scotch whisky. Everywhere whisky is enjoyed, it seems, it is now being made. Despite the refined nature of this exquisite drink, Scotch is in a fierce global competition for hearts and drams. There are pretenders to Scotland's throne across the world, even here. Cheeky bastards. Andrew Nelstrop comes from a Norfolk farming dynasty who have put their abundant barley to good use.
Farming sets you up well for having a distillery. They're both long-term businesses. Everything you do on the land, if you like, is designed for generations in the future. And the same goes with whiskey.
Do you know what the Greek definition of wisdom is?
Go on.
Wisdom is old men planting trees under whose shade they will never sit.
And that's the same with whiskey.
Beautiful, isn't it?
You're making whiskey that you'll probably never taste.
You don't have the hills, you don't have the glens, you don't have the peat, You don't have the wonderful soft rain that comes off the Atlantic and falls on Scotland. And yet here we are in the heart of England, and you're making bloody whiskey. Now that's a damn cheek.
But we do have...
Where'd you get your...
We have all the barley.
Uh-huh.
We have the largest peat digs in the whole of the UK, which is the Norfolk Broads.
Uh-huh.
We got the water. We've got the cleanest, largest fresh source of water underneath your feet. Don't really need anything else, do we? Apart from rain. We don't need rain.
You can have some of ours if you want.
Yeah. Well, look at today.
We've got plenty of it.
Father had always wanted to make whiskey purely because one conversation he had back in when he was a lad, and it was my grandfather, the story goes, said, it's such a shame we got all this barley, so it has to go to Scotland to be turned into something useful. And it just stuck. You know, my father, he farmed in Russia, Australia, he went all over the place doing different things. Every year he went, I need to build a distillery, I need to build a distillery.
So it was his dream?
Absolutely, lifelong dream. So when he turned 60, and he was going, we need to build a distillery, I think the rest of the family just went, do what you like.
Upstarts like yourself.
Yes.
Do you think you're any serious threat to the Scotch whisky industry? Are you nibbling away?
I think it's going to be a while before we buy Diageo, but could be another generation maybe.
There's ambition for you.
But I think in terms of quality, we can equal them. I think that's an issue. I don't think that's me going in our whiskey can. I think any nation's whiskey can equal anybody else's because each distillery is unique. So if the owners want to do it properly, they can make blooming good whiskey. In terms of volume, we're never going to compete.
Andrew, every distillery I go to, and certainly this is much more true now than it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, every distillery has a visitor centre, and it seems to be an important point of revenue for them.
Yes, yeah, it is.
And it's not just spreading the word, it's about bringing in hard-earned cash.
It is. It's incredibly useful in terms of spreading the word and getting a loyal following, you know, come and see the distillery and meet the people. It's a great story. For new distilleries opening up like ourselves, the gin boys and vodka boys have got it easy, you know, make the stuff yesterday, sell it today.
Yes.
Well, there's no cash flow issues there. Whereas the world of whiskey, make it today, sell it in 3, 5, 10 years' time, there is a slight need for another source of income. Which brings you down to having a shop and selling everything, from bottles of your own whiskey to tea and coffee and cake. And, yeah, it's a good source of income, and it's a nice day out for people.
Scotland's biggest whisky rival, however, is much further east. Over the last few years, the world of whisky has been rocked by a number of Japanese whiskies, winning critical acclaim and awards worldwide. Whisky's story has taken us halfway around the world. I'm now in the far north of Japan. If you fly that way, you hit Russia. We're probably on the same latitude as Vladivostok. Now, it's been a lovely sunny day, but from November till March, this place is blanketed in snow and well below freezing. And in the distance, you can see the scarlet chimneys that cap the Yoichi distillery, the home of Nika whiskey. And it seems very remote from a Highland glen, but this place, the story of this place, is firmly rooted in a true Scottish romance. In 1918, 24-year-old Masataka Taketsuru left Japan for Scotland. He was to study the chemistry and production of Scotch whisky with the aim of replicating it in Japan. Masataka served apprenticeships at a number of Scottish distilleries, learning every craft of the trade. He fell in love with whisky, but also with a Scottish girl, Rita Cowan from Kirkintilloch. Rita and Masataka toured Scotland picking up more secrets of the Scotch trade. When they arrived here in Japan in 1920, it was to set up home as man and wife. Together in 1934, they put their expertise into practice and founded this place, the Yoichi Distillery, choosing these surroundings for their echoes of the Scottish Highlands. They were married for 41 years, until Rita's death in 1961. Masataka was to become known as the father of Japanese whiskey. Author Dave Broom is here at Yoichi researching a book on Japanese whiskey. Dave, how does Japanese whiskey differ from Scotch?
Well, it's made in exactly the same way. So if you go around the distillery, you'll see essentially the same kit. But there's a whole number of different factors that make it Japanese. I mean, one of them is to do with the production. They run very clear wort rather than cloudy wort, so they don't get any cereal characters coming through. So it's not as dry as Scotch whisky. And there's more of a kind of it's a delicate intensity, which seems kind of paradoxical, but I describe it as a transparency of character. If you think of a Scotch single malt, it's like a bit of like a Scottish burn. You know, all the flavours are kind of moving around, and it's kind of hard to work out exactly what's going on, but it's complex. Whereas with Japanese whiskey, it's like a clear pool, and you can see all the flavours, and everything is just laid out in a very, very stately and ordered way. So it's got this
That's very
delicacy.
symptomatic of Japanese culture.
I think that's the point. I think because from the word go, Japanese whiskey was made to go with Japanese food. And if you think of the way the Japanese approach food, it's all about texture, it's also about delicacy. And if you're making a whiskey to go with that food, you're almost automatically going to be in that world. And there's a real cultural resonance to Japanese whiskey that ties in with the approach to ceramics or to artwork or to paper making. You know, I think it's all part of this Japanese culture. It's a very powerful and very, very deep whiskey. And it's significantly different to Scotch. You know, if I gave you two glasses blind and gave you one of Scotch and one of Japanese, you would say, well, that's different. So they make the best Japanese whiskey in the world.
Sakuna-san, you are the chief blender here in Yoichi. Mm-hmm. How important is the influence of Scotch whiskey and how it's made to how you make whiskey here?
当社の創業者の竹鶴正隆はスコットランドでウイスキー作りを学んで帰ってきたのはスコットランドなんですよね。で、彼が初め目指したのはスコッチのような美味しい本格的なウイスキーを日本で作るということが、彼がこの会社を作った目的なので、そういった意味では今でもその当然日本のウイスキーより伝統が長いですから、私はまだなんて言うんでしょうね、やっぱりスコッチウイスキーっていうのは我々のいわゆるマスターっていうんですかね、先生というかそういう存在であるということは私自身は忘れていないつもりです。やっぱりスコットランドのウイスキーが長い年月かけて培ってきたその美味しいウイスキーの作り方、そういうのをやはり大事にするという気持ちは今でも変わらないですし、これからも変えちゃいけないと思ってます。だからそこに例えばスコットランドの方が日本の清酒、例えば清酒の勉強をして、もしその方が本当にスコットランドでうまい日本酒を作ってやろうって考えてくれる人がもしいたら、それはとてもすごいことですし。
Before leaving Sapporo, I'm joining Dave Broom on a pilgrimage to the shared grave of Masataka Taketsuru and Rita Cowan, and leaving a traditional liquid offering. "800 miles south in Tokyo, there is another little corner of Scotland, a wee backstreet bar called the Helmsdale." Masaki.
Yes.
We're sitting here in the most beautiful bar I've ever been in my life. I think it's now my favourite bar. And we're in the heart of Tokyo, a Scotch whiskey bar. How did this happen?
僕はスコットランドが大好きで、ウイスキー、スコットランドの音楽。
But how did you meet Scottish people? How did you first drink whiskey?
僕が初めてスコットランドに行ったのが20歳の頃で、その時に大好きになりました、スコットランドが。
Now, your bar is called the Helmsdale. How did that happen? Why?
I like whiskey distillery, North Highland, Clynelish, Glenmorangie, Brora, inside, very small town Helmsdale name, very beautiful name sound.
What are the most popular whiskies? The top.
This brand very popular in the Talisker,
Talisker?
Yes.
Sky.
Japanese style with soda. The cocktail name Highball, Talisker Highball, very popular.
Do you think Scottish whiskey, Scotch whiskey, is under threat from Japanese whiskey, Indian whiskey, Tasmanian whiskey?
絶対に日本は勝てないです。ただスピリッツは一緒。でもスコットランドのウイスキーには勝てないけども、日本のウイスキーも頑張ってます。
Christian?
We'll never beat you, but we have the same heart. We'll try our best, but we'll keep trying.
A very poetic answer. I love it. Leaving Japan behind, I'm heading south to another whiskey hotbed, Australia, and specifically Tasmania. With sprawling hills, thick clouds and crashing sea, this could easily be Scotland. Across the bay from me is the charming city of Hobart, nestling at the foot of Mount Wellington. And on this captivating island, it cradles 14 distilleries with more on the way. In fact, it's the heartbeat of the Australian whisky industry, a growing power to behold. This is Lark Distillery, the cherished creation of Bill Lark, godfather of Australian whisky.
When Bill Lark wanted to start a whisky distillery, there'd been no commercial whisky distillery in Australia for 153 years. Federal law had made it impossible for small distilleries to operate. So before he could even start, he had to change government federal law to get his license. And so we are actually the first licensed commercial distillery in Australia.
Lark operates on a far smaller scale than most distilleries in Scotland. It's so titchy in size. I mean, if you compare this to something like the Macallan, I love the size. It's whiskey in miniature. And they're taking over the world, the bastards. Craig, a Scotsman, and Chris, a native, are distillers here.
I'll be honest, I got here 18 months ago and I walked into the place and I thought, where's the rest of the distillery? It's tiny, the scale is crazy. I mean, we talk about handcrafted back in Scotland and you're talking 250, 300,000 litres. Here we make 120 litres a day, so we can actually handcraft everything at the distillery. We ferment different to back in Scotland, and we make all of our cuts here by how the spirit tastes. We've got a longer fermentation than you'd have at most places back home. We've got 7 days, but really the big one for us is coming to the end of fermentation. Based on how it tastes, we'll actually open the lids and let the natural bacteria from the vineyard up the road into the ferments, and that sours up the
Of course,
wash.
you have the bacteria in the air already.
So,
Because you're surrounded, this is vineyard country, isn't it?
absolutely. So Frogmore, our pals up the road, make some of the best wine here, some of the best Pinots in Tasmania, and we get all the benefit from that culture and from those yeasts and bacteria.
So the whiskey that you guys have created, when will it be ready for sale?
We're looking at about a 6 to 7 year maturation in quarter cask. So something Tassie has is we have this really unique climate where we have a huge temperature variation from 2 or 3 degrees up to about 40 degrees. And what happens is that fluctuates every day and the pressure fluctuates every day. And that really drives the spirit in and out of the wood and drives that angel share. So we've got quite a high angel share here, 7 degrees. Our strength usually goes up, so we might get a spirit
So
coming
what
out.
percentage will you lose every year?
About 7%.
7%.
7% every year.
Guys, I've said that Tasmanian whiskies, now, and you're winning the awards, the whiskey awards around the world, you're the cheeky young upstarts. How much debt do you owe to the Scotch whiskey industry?
So much. so much. I don't think the industry here would be in any strength without the year on year help from the Scottish industry. We've been so lucky that the generosity. We talked before about that sense of community. It's not a community in Tasmania or Hobart or Australia or Scotland or Japan. It truly is this global community, and you really feel that. Like, you go to Scotland and you ask the question and you get a genuine, passionate answer. Yeah, we're indebted to the Scottish industry. This place wouldn't be what it is without Scotland.
We are essentially living the Australian version of what Glenlivet was in 1850. And I think if you said to any distiller back in Scotland, you know, if you could go back to 1850 and work in Glenlivet and see how things started, would you take that choice? Every single one of them would. We are still mashing in by hand with a paddle here. We've essentially brought whisky forward into the 1800s at Lark. So to be in this position, but also then be able to call on the history and the mistakes that have been made by the Japanese and the Scots and the Americans in their whisky making process puts us in a unique position. You know, we've got hundreds of years of experience to call upon, and then we can then create our own story from that.
There are stories that people expect to see when they buy into a whisky. So in Scotland, we can sometimes be a little bit trapped by that, and that's how people get to love this stuff. On the other, you've got countries in the rest of the world that are now making whiskies and can almost sometimes be a bit more creative in how they come about that and the sort of offering they can present.
The competition element, I think, is brilliant, because any good athlete or performer is going to say your best performances come when you're under the most pressure. So, you know, we're kept on our toes by the growth around the world, but I think that's a pretty good thing.
We've talked for a long time about what is whisky. It's an experience. It only becomes whisky once someone puts it in their glass and they drink it, they experience with their mates. It's on the most important days of your life that you drink whisky. Some people, it really is on the most important days, and they choose to share that with you as distillers, as people that get to be the caretaker of a distillery or a process. And that's what it's about. It's about understanding that if you're not spot on your game every day, then you're not doing justice to that person that got that bottle for their wedding, for their bucks, or maybe for their divorce, or to commiserate over a loved one's death. That's what drives that get better, get better, get better. And that's what whiskey's about. You're right, it's about people. It's always been about people. It's about community and people. And you can't help but love the spirit, because the people are wonderful.
Wow, Chris, that's the most beautiful poetic description I've ever heard.
Sullivan's Cove is another of Tasmania's flourishing distilleries. Its architecture and design is somewhat more functional than that of a Scottish distillery.
The idea of making whisky came along. At first I thought it was a bit of a crazy idea to make whisky here in Tasmania.
Where did it come from?
Well, Bill and Lynn Lark, actually. But I can remember him trying to sell the idea to us up at the pub one night. And how him and his father-in-law had been up in the lakes here fishing, and they're drinking a bottle of whiskey, wondering why we don't make whiskey in Tasmania. We've got the climate, we've got the water, we've got the barley, everything's here.
You've got the peat.
We've got the peat. We've got everything we need. Why don't we do it? And so he came and one night up at the pub and told us of this idea, and what a marvellous idea it was. And I can remember thinking, no, Bill, this is not a good idea. This is not one of your better ideas. But I was wrong. It's one of these things where, to be honest, we didn't know we'd ever survive or even get our product out of Tasmania. I mean, it was a struggle for a long time to get anybody here to even try it. In the early days, people thought, oh, look, isn't that a nice idea? They're having a go, they're trying to make a bit of whiskey. But you've got to earn your stripes. It's not a matter of just making a product and everybody will buy it just because you make it. You have to prove that it's worth buying in the first place, or in our case, worth drinking. And it took us a while to get it right. And in some of the earlier whiskies that were made, I have to say, weren't the best. But once we got the theory right and we got the practice right and we started making good whiskey, we found that we could sell it. But mostly overseas. So it was France that first took us on. Once we'd won the world's best single malt whisky out of the UK, the World Whiskies Awards, everything changed. From that morning on, it hasn't stopped. I mean, I can remember standing in our Bond store a few years ago. We had a bit over 1,000 barrels, thinking, what have we done? We've made too much whisky, we'll never sell this. What are we going to do? And now I look at our whisky and think, God, I wish we had 10 times more.
The extent of the Tasmanian whisky revolution is startling. It is a surprise. Yet when you're here, it makes perfect sense. In some ways, this place is a mirror image of Scotland. Closer to home and yet aesthetically different to Scotland, there is another surprisingly vibrant whisky country, Sweden. Ingvar Rond from Malmö compiles the Malt Whisky Yearbook, seen by many as the Bible of Scotch. Ingvar is leading the way to the small island of Ven, visiting its distillery and spirit laboratory.
I think the interest in whisky started probably in the, I would say, 60s and 70s, when we started to watch all these fantastic TV series from England, where in every 2 minutes they were drinking a whiskey. Coming home after work, they were sipping a whiskey. And we've always, in Scandinavia, and Sweden in particular, been influenced by British culture. So that's when I think we started to embrace whiskey. And then it took off fantastically in the 90s, where it wasn't just about drinking whiskey. It was about going to the distillery to see how it's produced, about learning about whiskey. I know that some Scotch whisky brand ambassadors who come to whisky shows in Sweden, they're absolutely amazed about the knowledge that Swedish whisky drinkers have.
Ven Distillery was founded in 2007 and is one of 8 in Sweden. As well as making whisky, it houses a state-of-the-art laboratory, providing services for drinks companies across the world.
What we do here is our Swedish whisky. It's our whisky, not definitely just Swedish or Scottish. Still, most of the Scottish people are just Vikings not traveling back. So you have the heritage from us anyway. But end of the day, there's so many different whiskies, and the one doesn't kill off the others. There's a whiskey for all. What we do in here is we're very particular about our oak maturation, but also how we create the cut. Obviously, being small, we need to have our unique selling points, and we need to make something that really tastes, really scents, because volume couldn't be our sale thing. So we go into special varieties of fermentation, special yeast strains, special varieties of wood, for example, but also with the laboratory, where we have a unique possibility of actually seeing what's happening during maturation. We do analysis for a wide variety of distillers around the world.
A lot of people say that now the Scotch whisky industry is in big trouble because they are being chased by so many producers around the world. Yes, there is more competition now, but at the same time, we have at least 100 distilleries in Scotland. We have 400 or 500 years of tradition in Scotland. You can't just wipe that away just because there are new distilleries that started 10, 15, 20 years ago producing in Tasmania or Sweden. They make beautiful whiskey, but for the next 20 or 30 years, I don't see them as a huge competitor to Scotch whisky.
Back on the mainland in Malmö is the Bishop's Arms, a cosy British-themed pub specialising in single malts and run by Croatian whisky fanatic Maja Kozul.
I'm very curious about everything, to be honest, and I think whiskey is very good to have, enjoy. It's very much about people. That is a different driving Ferrari, or that is a different riding a bicycle. And that is if you compare whiskey with something else.
Every Bishop's Arms staff member is trained to become a whisky specialist and advocate.
Service is very important. There is still people who come in our bar and they look at the shelves and say, what is all that? And you start there. And can I have a double whiskey? And we start often saying, well, would you mind to have 3 smaller ones, same amount, same money, and just discover something new? So you kind of have to educate your guests as you're educating your staff at the same time.
The Bishop's Arms has won 2 prestigious awards. Maya is spending the prize money on a celebratory staff trip.
We're going to spend that money with a trip to Scotland, of course. I'm going to be visiting Glenkinchie Distillery, and we're just going to have an inspiration trip with my staff so we can keep it live.
Glenkinchie is a lowland distillery outside of Edinburgh, founded in 1837.
Pleasant smell. Yeah.
Yes.
You extract that out of the still. And you finish with the distillation.
We take between 65 and 70%.
By the old port of Leith, it's time for a trip to Tuchter's Landing, a pub whose assets include a high-stakes game of hoopla.
we just checking if they have any whiskey we don't. So we try that one. It's very good to see how other people work with the whiskey, not just us.
It's a living product. It's not just something you pour into a bottle and pour colorant in. It's a living product that goes into cask and it's made of barley. It makes it a lot more real to see a distillery and see why you should appreciate whiskey.
Our guide Clive was very good. I thought it was really good. He showed us a picture up from about 100 years ago with about 50 people who used to work there, and it was really interesting just seeing that must have been the whole village worked at the distillery. And now he told us that it's 2 people work 12 hours and then 2 people do the late shift, and the whole thing runs off that. How the whiskey making has changed over 100 years, but they can still get the same product.
Ready? Oh! I get a bucket of ice.
Should we have a hoop?
We should have a hoop.
Have to hide away all the single cask Ardbeg though.
Yeah. I'm not sure how that's going to work out with the Swedish alcohol law, because selling alcohol in Sweden is not allowed to be fun. It has to be quite straight and direct. There's no such thing as happy hour in Sweden.
This is the great city of London. A city that has quaffed whiskey for hundreds of years. It's also a city that has begun to distill its own whiskey yet again. And it's also the city that has stoked the debate about how exactly this drink should best be devoured. And that includes, and this is heretical, some mutiny against tradition for some, including myself, drinking whiskey and cocktails. Now, I'm about to go into this hotel to talk to the 2015 World Barman of the Year. And if he mixes me a cocktail, he's going straight to the tower. Ryan, on a daily basis, you commit sacrilege in this bar because you take some really, really decent whiskies that take years and years to mature into all their richness of flavours, and then you throw in all sorts of other liquids, and you throw in strawberry crushes and you botanicals, and you make dreadful cocktails out of them.
I am guilty of that.
Why?
To me, it's been the beauty of whiskey. It does have big, bold flavours. It's got all of these interesting characteristics. And to me, a cocktail is just a new way of experiencing that. So to me, it's not about kind of masking any of the flavours and just hiding it away as a bland alcohol. The beauty of using Scotch in these things is it has all these characteristics.
Whiskey should be drunk any way you want it to be. I am a big fan of not being prescriptive about drinking whiskey, and I think we're seeing that more and more nowadays. I love whiskey cocktails, whiskey highballs, whiskey neat, whiskey on the rocks, in a nosing glass, being more professional, or literally out of a flask when I'm walking up a big hill and it's freezing cold.
I think the industry need to find a way of keeping their older consumer happy by doing, what they love and what they're going to keep buying, but also not being scared to innovate and, not being scared to talk about putting in mixes and talk about putting in ice and water and, getting more people just to experiment with it and find out what they like, rather than using the old method where it was kind of preached and you were told you must drink it neat, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. And I think that image has really turned a lot of people off.
So however you want to drink your scotch, you drink your scotch however you like it. And don't let anybody tell you can't. But there are limits. So I got my father, for one Christmas, a really expensive bottle of Highland Park. Highland Park is a beautiful scotch. And I took it round and we were celebrating Christmas. And the first thing he did was he opened it, and there was a bottle of dry ginger at one side and this really amazing bottle of Highland Park at the other. And they both went in the same glass. So that's where you draw the limit.
If you want to get somebody to experience a new spirit, something different, a new flavour, it can be a bit much just giving them a neat dram, especially when you've got something cask strength or smoky, and all of a sudden they're put off by it. Everybody's got that story of kind of drinking whiskey, stealing it from their dad's cabinet and going, no, I don't like the stuff, and they stick with that idea. Whereas whiskey runs this amazing gauntlet of flavour, and you've got light, delicate lowland drams through to big, smoky, rich Islers, and you want people to go, right, actually there's a new way of experiencing this, and using a cocktail, if you do it delicately, is a way of introducing new flavours to them. Actually, this drink's been on our menu since the beginning. And I've always tried to involve whiskey cocktails. It's my favourite spirit, it's what I've loved. I lived in Scotland for a long time, it's very close to my heart. So this is essentially a twist on a whiskey sour, but it is a bit of an unusual one. So I'm going to warn you of that before I get started.
If people want to enjoy their whiskey with a lot of nosing and sniffing and looking at the colour, well, good for them. It's their whiskey, they've bought it. If they want to slam the glass full of ice and stick a branded cola on top of it, well, I might wince. It might not be for me, but it's their whiskey, it's a free world. On they should go, as long as they enjoy it.
This idea that thou shalt not touch really only is about 30 years old. And I think it's done irreparable damage to the Scotch whisky industry, because it's a strong drink, and people take a sip of it because you're not allowed to add water to it. Gee, come on. It's about pleasure, guys. It's not about pain. So, I would add anything you want to Scotch whisky. Just enjoy it, because it might be a great complex drink, but it's just a drink.
Ryan, the more I explore whisky, the more I realise it is a form of alchemy.
Mm-hmm.
And you're taking it a stage further, aren't you?
Well, to me, your whiskey blenders, be that blended whiskey, be that single malts, they're essentially making cocktails. They're bringing all these different elements together, creating a harmony that tastes greater than the sum of its parts. Hopefully this is going to be a new side of this whiskey that you won't have tried. So
this will be a first time for me.
Okay, I'm hoping this works.
That's surprisingly refreshing. Dare I admit it? I'll probably lose half my friends.
So what does the future hold in store for Scotch? Not only is there an explosion of small-scale craft distilleries, some of the older established producers are investing big money too. This is Strathspey in the northeast of Scotland. It's an area that contains the greatest density of whisky distilleries anywhere in the world. It is also home to the Macallan, one of the best loved and most revered whiskies in the world. Macallan have been here for over 200 years. But currently, the demand for Macallan is outstripping supply. So the company are investing the small sum of £100 million in creating a cathedral of whisky, due to open in 2017. This beautiful new distillery on the island of Harris is proof too that there is confidence in the future of Scotch.
It's a very exciting time, I think, for distilling, especially here in Scotland. We've got a lot of new distilleries appearing. There's a lot of gin distilleries which are going to be leading into making whisky. But the same thing's happening all across mainland Europe, all throughout Asia. There's a lot of new distilleries appearing. But I think it's very important that Scotland doesn't lose focus so that they keep creating very high-quality spirit. But I think we're lucky in a way because we have the heritage that all of these mainland European distilleries and Asian distilleries will never have the same heritage as Scotland has.
The big challenge in whisky is trying to balance innovation and tradition. I think it's very possible to do that and to produce something amazing.
I don't know if it's going to turn out just as fine as everyone in the industry thinks and hopes and believes, and there are going to be some casualties on the way. Maybe some of those small craft distilleries are going to fall by the wayside in that kind of creative destruction of the marketplace. But overall, I think we probably will take the right turn. I think we will go on to the sunlit uplands, and I think there is a bonny future for Scotch.
We've made Scotch whisky for hundreds of years. It has proved the test of time. It is revered as the pinnacle of the distiller's art worldwide. Because of its character, its quality, its soul, and it will continue to do well.
So I see it actually as a moment of opportunity for Scotch whisky, because the more that the Scotch whisky industry is looking over its shoulder, sort of going, well, bourbon's becoming popular, maybe we should be like bourbon, or Japanese is becoming popular, can we be like Japanese? Then you've lost it. You've lost the battle completely.
But not everyone is as confident about the future.
I actually think that if you look at whisky, the historic whisky graph, it goes up and down. You remember in the 80s with the Whisky Lake and shut half of Scotland's distilleries? It's coming. What have Scotland done? Doubled production in the last 4 years. The moment that whisky is live and ready for sale, we haven't suddenly got twice as many whisky drinkers in the world. Therefore, this is just there has to be a mountain of whisky building. And at some point, it'll all go down and we'll all have a bit of a downturn. And then
So what's your opinion on, say, the Macallan spending $100 million on this new facility?
Really cool. But did they, they've doubled production. Do they think they can sell twice as much whisky? If they can, brilliant. But that means somebody else isn't selling any.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't suddenly got everyone buying twice as many bottles. So the industry has to do a bit of a dip. And those that have got their houses in order will be fine, and those that have borrowed to the hilt and expecting it to continue willy-nilly probably will wake up with a headache. But we'll see. That's the joy of whisky. I mean, you design a business to work over generations, not over a decade cycle.
As I have seen, Scotch whisky sprung from Caledonian terrain and bewitched the world. Its ascendancy has been driven by pioneers, from early innovators and the entrepreneurs who first exported our wares, to today's scientists, blenders and craft distillers. Yet what strikes me most is, despite all that, the drink itself remains a charming enigma. The causes of its sumptuous taste impossible to agree upon, and even opaque and mysterious. There will be peaks and troughs and pretenders to the throne, but because of that sorcery, Scotland's tipple of genius will always prevail. The future's bright. The future's amber.
I'm getting very near last orders, folks. And the end of my journey. A wonderful journey through the magical world of whisky. I hope you've enjoyed it. From Highland Crofter to Hobart Visionary, there's an amber thread that embroiders the globe. When a cunning alchemist distills a spirit, the liquid drops fall into a cask, and there something truly, truly colossal happens. Scotch whisky affects history and defines identity. It embraces science and big business and the land. And yet at its heart, this mixture of water, barley and yeast is just a simple, beautiful taste of heaven in a glass. Slàinte.